Greetings from the Women's Basketball Hall of Fame. The game of women's basketball has changed a lot since I wrote the 1901 Spalding Rulebook. You need to visit the Women's Basketball Hall of Fame in Knoxville, where they celebrate the past, present, and future of the women's game. So much to see and do. Cheers, Senda Berenson.
Hey out there. Welcome to this afternoon's conversation with Bruce Feiler, author of Life is in the Transitions. I'm your session host, Jonathan Haupt, coming to you live from Beaufort, South Carolina, here in the nonprofit Pat Conroy Literary Center, gleefully making my annual appearance for the Southern Festival of Books. The festival is presented by Humanities Tennessee with the generous support of Metro Nashville Arts Commission, Ingram Content Group, Tennessee Arts Commission, Vanderbilt University, and Parnassus Books. And since I mentioned Parnassus, let me also point out that for those of you in the session with us, at some point in the chat, you'll see a link for how to purchase Bruce's book through Parnassus, or also to make a donation to the Literary Festival as well. Joining us from the faraway land of Brooklyn is our guest, Bruce Feiler. Bruce is the author of 15 books, 7 of which are New York Times bestsellers, including The Secrets of Happy Families, Council of Dads, which inspired an NBC drama filmed in Savannah, not far from where we are, and Walking the Bible, which was one of 2 PBS shows that was adapted as a PBS show, one of 2 that Bruce hosted. His 2 TED Talks have been watched more than 2 million times, and if we had not been able to get him on the feed, we were just going to live stream one of those TED Talks instead, because they're really handy that way. Bruce is a native of Savannah, not far from us here in Beaufort. And this afternoon, we'll be discussing his newest book, Life is in the Transitions, Mastering Change at Any Age, which is a book that I had the great pleasure of reviewing for the Charleston Post and Courier. It's one I've gotten to give as gifts many times already as well. It's a book that's been very meaningful to me, as I know it is to everybody who's had a chance to read it. So thank you so much for joining us, Bruce. I really appreciate it.
Well, Jonathan, it's great to be with you. Let me just give a salute and a hug to I didn't mention in that very generous, overly generous introduction that I lived in Nashville for many years and wrote a book about country music and have many friends at the Tennessee Humanities Council and many wonderful memories of being in Nashville at this event. So I'm delighted to be back with all of my friends across the Southeast. I'm delighted to be with you. Thank you for that generous review in the Charleston paper. And since you're not going to say it, I'm going to say it, that apparently you're sitting at a desk that the estimable and really sort of my single greatest hero in life, Pat Conroy, used as somebody who grew up in Savannah and spent my childhood on Tybee Island. What Pat always represented to me was that somebody who came from where I came from could write books that could reach a much broader audience. And so it was a highlight of my life to become friendly with Pat later in my writing life. And I'm always happy to honor his role in all of our lives and in my life in particular.
I'm glad you mentioned that because Mr. Conroy makes a one-sentence cameo appearance in Life is in the Transitions, in which you do credit him as a role model of sorts. He was a mentor to me in that regard as well. And as you aptly point out, this is Pat's desk from Fripp Island, which is behind me. This is really the heart of our Conroy Center. And it was at this desk that Pat wrote Beach Music. And there's a line from Beach Music, which I think relates very much to your book, right, and to what I hope we get to talk about this afternoon as well. And it's simply this: no life is a straight line. That seems sort of essential to Life is in the Transitions. So what I'd love for you, jump in, please.
No, please. I want to, by the way, if you can hear the sounds of Brooklyn outside my window, I apologize. It sounds like they're doing some work in the street. And I I'm happy to talk about this life shape thing because I think that for me, it was sort of the key moment in this whole process. But you were about to ask a question, so let you ask your question before I jump into my story here.
Well, I was going to ask you about the moments in your life, which were not in a straight line, which threw you off track, which you speak about so candidly, so powerfully in the introduction to this book that really sent you on the path to gather the stories and ultimately write the book. So I'd love for you to talk about that.
So I'll talk about both. I think that for me, it was sort of a combination of my own personal story coupled with this moment where I began to think about life shape that you talk about, Pat, bringing up in Beach Views. And my own life will start in Savannah. So I grew up in 5 generations of Jews in Georgia. And I left there and I went north to go to college at Yale. And I left there and went to Japan. And I started writing letters home. This was the mid 1980s. I'm dating myself, but I wrote these letters on crinkly airmail paper where, the old pads, it was like onion skin, and then like the bottom of the pad had the lines, and you would stick it under the paper. So I wrote these letters home like, you're not going to believe what happened to me. And then I came back to where you're sitting now and where I was living at the time in the coastal empire, as we used to call it at that time, in the southeast coast of Georgia and South Carolina. And everywhere I went, people said, I loved your letters. I was like, great. Have we met? And it turned out that my grandmother had Xeroxed them and passed them around, and they went sort of viral in this old-fashioned sense of the word. And I thought, well, I should write a book about it. And it doesn't happen this way. But I sold my first book at 24. Actually, this allows me to tell my favorite Pat Conroy story, which is when he sold The Water is Wide about his time teaching on Defusky. His literary agent called him up and said, Pat, I got good news, $10,000. And Pat said, really? That's all I have to pay? So I got, frankly, not that much more than that to write my first book, Learning to Bow, about teaching in junior high school in Japan. And that sort of plunged me into this life. And in my 20s, I wrote books about Japan, about England. I spent a year as a circus clown traveling around the Southeast with the Clyde Beatty Cole Brothers Circus. I then moved to Nashville, and I wrote this book, Dreaming Out Loud, about kind of the boom years of Nashville in the 90s. I spent a year with Garth Brooks. And it was around this time that I thought I should be more conversant with the Bible. So I took it was actually my bar mitzvah Bible, and I put it by my bed on Woodmont Road in Nashville, and it sat there untouched for 2 years, gathering dust. And then I went to see an old friend in Jerusalem, and on my kind of first day there, my friend said, over there's this controversial neighborhood, and over there's the rock where Abraham went to sacrifice Isaac. And that was the first time I thought, oh, these are real stories that you can touch and visit and feel. And that's when I had the idea that I should like retrace the Bible through the desert and read the stories along the way. That became Walking the Bible. It spent a year and a half on the bestseller list. And you mentioned the TV shows, and I went back and forth in my 30s, and this was my life. And so this life, I think of now as being a kind of classic linear life that we all fantasize about, right? I figured out what I wanted to do early. I did it for no money. I had some success. I got married. I had children. And then to your question, I then just got walloped by life in my 40s. First, I got cancer, as you know, as a new dad at 43. So nonlinear. I had an adult onset pediatric cancer. I asked a group of friends to form a council of dads, and that led to the TV series you mentioned on NBC this year. I also went bankrupt. Almost went bankrupt. That was the recession, and my family owned a bunch of real estate in Georgia. But then the big event was that my dad, who has Parkinson's, tried to take his own life 6 times in 12 weeks. And these conversations were unhavable in my family, but I'm the story guy. I'm the meaning guy. I like, in a certain way, to run into the fire and explore pain and what that means. And so one Monday morning, I sit down and I said, I'm going to send my dad a question. In this case was, tell me about the toys you played with as a child. And he couldn't even move his fingers, but he dictated the answer to Siri. And I was like, that worked. I brought him back to life in a way. So I sent another one. Tell me about the house you grew up in. And this went on and on and on. Tell me about the toys you played with. Tell me about the, how'd you become an Eagle Scout? How'd you join Mom? How'd you meet Mom? How'd you join the Navy? And this was this powerful, for me, experience of how when our lives have difficult circumstances, we have to rethink and reimagine the story of our lives that we tell ourselves. And really what happened, Jonathan, is when I told everybody else about this, everybody had a similar story. My wife had a headache and went to the hospital and died. My my daughter has an anxiety disorder. My boss is a crook. My brother has stage 4, whatever it might be. And everybody was saying, like, the life I'm living is not the life I expected. Like, I'm living out of order in some kind of fundamental way. And I called my wife one night and I said, no one knows how to tell their story anymore. I got to figure out how to help. And that led me on this process of crisscrossing the country and collecting what became hundreds of life stories of Americans of all ages and all walks of life, all 50 states. And then I spent a year kind of coding them, trying to tease out themes and takeaways for how we deal with these life quakes, as I call them, these massive periods of life. And I guess the last thing I'll say is that I worked on this book for half a decade. And lo and behold, it arrives this summer at the moment when the entire planet is going through a life quake at the exact same time.
It becomes, it would always have been timely because these things are always happening in our individual lives, but it comes out at a time when something major, a major life quake is happening in all of our lives simultaneously as well, which has really been an interesting framework to read and appreciate the book as well. But I'm really wondering about those early moments when you first start gathering the stories, when you make the decision. Was it comforting or discomforting to discover that they're happening to everybody and they're happening all the time, that this is something that unites us, that our lives are always being disrupted?
Well, that's a very interesting question. So I think that what I want to say is I didn't go into this looking for life quakes or life transitions. I just went into it kind of thinking writerly, actually, almost as a storytelling matter. Like, how do you tell the story of your life? And that's when, and this will enable me to talk about the shape thing that we mentioned at the top. So the key moment, the way I think about it now, is so I was doing two things. I was like interviewing these, I was like setting out on these interviews. And then at the same time, I was like doing all this reading about this. It turns out there's all these fields, narrative gerontology, about using storytelling among older people to reimagine their lives. Narrative adolescence, the age of my children, when adolescents start thinking of their lives as a story. Narrative medicine, when we get sick. So I'm like parallel interviewing and reading at the same time. And what happened on the reading side was that I don't know if it's a fantasy, if it's a myth, it's a fairy tale, but I feel like one day I pulled a book off a shelf and like the entire shelf opened and I was in a different room. And what was in that different room was an idea that was entirely new to me. Turns out to be kind of new to a lot of people, but I didn't know that this at the time. And that idea was that our lives have a kind of paradigmatic shape. And what defines that shape is basically sort of how we look at the world affects how we look at our lives. So in the ancient world, right, we were talking about this, I spent a lot of time, I wrote 5 books about the Bible and made 10 hours of primetime television. They didn't have linear time, right? So they think that all lives are a cycle, and they follow sort of the agricultural cycle to every season, turn. In the Middle Ages, and obviously I lay all this out in the book, as you know, they think life is a staircase up to middle age and then a staircase down. So think about that. For them, middle age is the peak. Like, that's the opposite for those of us who grew up in the 20th century who were told that middle age was the bottom. So that's no new life at 50, no second love at 60, no stepping down from your job and opening, and moving to Beaufort and opening a B&B. Like, it's like straight up and then straight down. And then for the last 100 years since the birth of science, we were told life is going to follow a line. And why did we think this way? Because that's what the industrial model of economics was, right? So Freud, there's Piaget, there's stages. Freud, there's stages. Erickson says he models it off of the factory floor. This reaches its peak with Gail Sheehy in the 70s, who writes Passages, a book that sells 20 million copies. And it says everybody does the same thing in their 20s, same thing in their 30s, and then has a midlife crisis at 39 and a half. Like, it must start at 39 and a half and it must end by 44. Now, this turns out to be total bunk. And now we know that life is chaotic, that it follows all, periods of stability and instability. Like, just think about the pandemic, right? If you're between 39 and 44, which you appear to be in this picture, like, you're having a midlife crisis. But if you're 27 or 15, like my children, my twin daughters, or 67, you're having a crisis too. The point is that some people's lives are born in a life quake if their parents are getting divorced. Some people lose a parent as a teenager, as my kids almost lost one themselves. Some people have addiction in their 20s. Some people, whatever it is, that these come at us at all times. And this idea of a linear life, those of us of a certain age are kind of trapped in what I call the ghost of linearity. We still expect it, but one of the interesting things that happen in these conversations is that Xers kind of get this idea of nonlinearity intuitively more than boomers, and then millennials, I would say, get it intuitively more than Xers. And millennials know they're going to have 12.7 jobs and 11.7 moves, and they know that sexuality, relationships are all much more nonlinear. So in some ways, they get this idea of that change is bombarding us all the time much more intuitively than their elders. And I think their elders, in fact, there's a tension between kind of boomers and their millennial kids. Because the boomers were saying, what do you mean you're having a baby before you get married? Or like, what do you mean you're quitting one job before you have another? Or like, what do you mean you're moving to a new city and you don't know what you're going to do when you get there? Like, they're much more comfortable with the nonlinear life, as I call it, than their parents are.
It's a kind of narrative structure, right? It's an
Yes.
expectation of how your story is going to unfold, and it unfolds differently for different generations. I mentioned in my comments earlier that I've given this book as a gift a couple of times. One of those was to a 16-year-old intern here at the Conroy Center, and she and her dad have been reading it. And I'm going to ask a question on her behalf too, because it's something that you're moving us toward anyway. What advice do you have, or what advice did you gather from younger folks about how to prepare for a life that is a bombardment of change, and which change is the constant? What's the lesson? What's the takeaway?
So I think that, a couple of things about that. First of all, I think that now that the book has been out for a bit, it became a top 10 New York Times bestseller because it landed in this moment, which has been gratifying to have it reach people in this moment of visceral need. I think the number one reaction that people have is a kind of relief that they're not alone, that this feeling that they have that life is kind of bombarding them from all directions, that they're not alone in feeling that. So kind of one of the things that I've tried to do is put a language to this, right? The sort of big theme of this is that the linear life is dead. It's been replaced by what I call the non-linear life. And as you know, I have this data that we go through 36 disruptors in the course of our lives. That's one every 12 to 18 months. Most of those we get through, but then 1 in 10 becomes this life quake. And this life quake leads to life transitions, and that life transitions are a skill that we can and must master. So that's sort of the frame. So turning now to the question that your colleague and intern asks is that, first of all, can we just talk for a second? Did I hear you correctly that you said that this is an intern at the Pat Conroy Center and that she's 60 years old? Right there, that's nonlinear.
16.
Oh, 16. Oh, I thought you said 60.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, well, just the idea of a 60-year-old intern is in of itself an inspirational example of the nonlinear life. Well, this is interesting. Okay, so I was born in 1964, okay, in Savannah, Georgia. And that means I'm technically the last year of the baby boom. So this 16-year-old, like my daughter, they're sort of Generation Z. So she was born, let's just say in 2004. I divided up these life quakes that people have, and we coded them, and 53% were involuntary life quakes. So an involuntary life quake is a diagnosis, losing your job, having a child with special needs, a pandemic. But 47% were voluntary, right? So voluntary is moving, changing jobs, cheating on your spouse, changing your religions, changing your sexual orientation, whatever it might be. And what's interesting is that I looked at these numbers and I thought, ooh, man, 47% of these are voluntary. Like, we are embracing this nonlinearity. Like, we're getting the opportunity that we can write our own story. The millennials, who are my coders, like the cohort up from your colleague, were like, whoa, 53% were involuntary? Like, I don't control my life. So I think that the number one lesson I would say is that whether the life quake is voluntary or involuntary, the transitions that come out of it must be voluntary. Like, you have to choose to lean in and go through the steps that I talk about in the second half of the book that allows you to navigate these transitions more effectively. So be the hero of your own story is really what I would say. So that whenever you do face these situations, whether you chose it or whether it chose you, you have the ability to write the story, to go through the steps, to transition, to get through a healthy or a happy place. I mean, I think people tend to do one of two things when they get into a life quake. And anybody living through the pandemic can relate to this. Either they make a 217 item to-do list and say, I'm going to do it this weekend, and I'm going to be the world champion transition goer througher. Or they're stuck in place like they're in quicksand and they are in a fetal position on their bed, and then this has never happened to anyone but me, and woe is me, and I'm never going to get through it. But you look at enough of them, as I did, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them day after day, 2, 3, 4 a day, 2, 3, 4 per interview, and certain patterns begin to appear. Even the basic sort of idea that transitions involve 3 phases. The long goodbye, where you're saying goodbye to the life that you left behind. The messy middle, where you're shedding certain habits and creating and experimenting with new ones. And the new beginning, where you are unveiling your new self and kind of updating your story. So even that idea that there are 3 phases, in the first 100 years people talked about transitions, we were told, like the last major book on transitions was written by a guy named Bill Bridges, an English professor in 1979. And he said, you must go through the phases in order. Like first you must say goodbye. Then you must go through the betwixt and the between, they were called then. That's not how people do it. Like it turns out people are good at one of these phases and bad. Like they have kind of a superpower and a kryptonite. So again, a piece of advice, for your colleague or anybody going through a transition, and I try in the book to kind of walk you through to figure out which of these stages, maybe you're good at the messy middle. Maybe you like making lists and calling friends, and start there, like build some confidence. It's going to be hard. And then go back and do maybe the emotional heavy lifting of mourning and saying goodbye to the past that's not coming back.
That's fantastic advice. And I'm glad you mentioned the 3 phases of two, which were very eye-opening for me. Let me mention here that we're very happy to take audience questions as well. If you'll do us the favor of putting those in the chat, we hope to get to those just a few minutes here.
So let me ask you, Jonathan, so which phase are you best at? I'm going to turn the tables on you.
No, I'm glad you did, because that's why it was so eye-opening to me. It turns out I'm pretty good at the long goodbye. That's actually fairly short for me. I am perpetually stuck in the messy middle, and I'm sitting here in the middle of a fairly new nonprofit. So that's both my professional life and everything else too, right? We're always in the middle of something that isn't quite fully formed.
Yeah.
Trying to get to that, to the new beginning, right? Which is the goal. But I wonder, how many people actually do get all the way to the new beginning? And is that enough? Is that ultimately the goal? Mr. Conroy said late in life in an interview that it was the voyage out that mattered, right? Not the destination. And you're a guy who knows quite a lot about pilgrimage, this whole idea of going towards something that maybe you never actually get to.
Well, it's interesting you bring up pilgrimages, and I do know a lot about pilgrimages. And for those of you who don't know, I hosted a television show on PBS called Sacred Journeys with Bruce Feiler, where I went on 6 pilgrimages in 1 calendar year to Israel, France, Nigeria, Japan, India, and Israel. Did I say Israel? Do I have all 6 there? There's a kind of parallel between pilgrimages and transitions. Like first there's the call, like first there's the impetus to make the journey, right? And then you have to prepare and you go on this journey and kind of have to say goodbye, and then you get there, but there is a kind of return. And the last phase of a transition is when you come back and reintegrate and try to carry the lessons from the pilgrimage back into the life from which you were called originally. And that's a similar part of kind of unveiling your new self, as I call it, and updating your life story. So let me just say a couple of things, about that. The short answer to your question is yes. Well, 90. I'll start there, and then I'll work my way backwards. 90% of the people that I spoke to said they got through their life transition. 90. And in fact, probably if I divided the people who didn't say they got through it, I was probably too close, because this leads to kind of one of the things that I want to say, which is, okay, so I said we have these disruptors every 12 to 18 months, okay? That could be an accident, it could be a job change, it could be, and I want to say that some of these are happy and some of these are sad, like, having a child. I'm a parent of identical twins. Like, that was a lifequake by any measure. I mean, it was a joyful one, but everything changed, forevermore in that moment. So sometimes joyful things like getting married, having a child, becoming an empty nester, retiring, these are expected, anticipated, in a way, voluntary lifequakes, but they're still lifequakes and they still change us. The average length of these lifequakes is 5 years. Like, to me, this was one of the most eye-opening parts of it. And maybe you don't want to be told this because you're in the middle of trying to build this nonprofit center in Beaufort in honor of Pat Conroy. But you think we're going to go through 3 to 5 in our lifetime, and they take 4, 5, or 6 years? That's 25 years. That's half of our adult lives we spend in transition. I mean, one of the things, that's a kind of a stark blinking light here. You or someone is going through a life transition right now. And in fact, now that I see the reaction to the book in the marketplace, like, a lot of people are responding to the book because they're in a lifequake, because the entire planet is in a lifequake for the first time, in a century, a collective involuntary lifequake in the terms of my book. But then I maybe even a greater market for this book is people who were living with someone or who have a loved one going through it, and they want to be able to give some advice and to give some support that is helpful. So basically, the way I think about it, Jonathan, is that life gets us stuck, and the life transition is the mechanism to get unstuck. And it is a mechanism that has been around. I mean, if you go to the oldest scriptural traditions, think about that. This is the Southern Festival. Like, we can talk scripture here, but if you look at all of the scriptural traditions, have stories in which people leave the civilized world, go into the desert, have a transformative experience. I'm talking about Abraham. I'm talking about Moses. I'm talking about Jesus. I'm talking about Paul. I'm talking about Muhammad. And you can keep going. You can talk about the Buddha. You can talk the Hindus with forest dwelling. You can go to the great stories. You can go to Oedipus, Jason, Hercules, Orpheus. I mean, you can go time and again. The great stories have stories of people leaving the comfortable world, going into this state of disconnection and discombobulation, and then coming back. And so this is the reason why this book that we're talking about here is, where's the camera, is called Life is in the Transitions, which is a William James phrase from 100 years ago, because the point is, if you're going to spend half of your life in this state of in-between, and if you just look at it as a period you have to grit or grind or grovel your way through, you are missing half of your life. Because it is difficult. There is pain involved. There's confronting difficult emotions. Maybe you're good at the long goodbye, in which case you're going to have to shed certain habits and, in your case, create new ones when you're building something. Or maybe you're good at that, and then you have to confront the top 3 emotions people experience, which is fear. Mm-hmm. I'm afraid of what's going to come. Am I going to survive? I don't have money. Sadness. I liked the old life. I liked having that loved one with me. I like having my legs before I lost them in an accident in the dunes north of Grand Rapids, which is a story in my book, as you know. And then the third one was shame. I'm ashamed I need help. I'm ashamed of what I did when I was drinking too much. I'm ashamed to have a child who has an addiction. Like, you have to confront these emotions. It's difficult, but if you only look at it as a period that's difficult, and you don't see the opportunity for growth and renewal and updating your story, and then kind of reinventing yourself, you are missing half of your life. And that's kind of the big message here, is back to your intern. What I want to say is, when these do come to you, these life quakes, these periods of betwixt and between, it's going to be difficult, but look at them as opportunities to reinvent, revisit, rewrite, retell, and ultimately reimagine your life story.
Again, it's fantastic advice, Bruce, and timely in so many ways too. I want to pick up on 2 things that you mentioned, because I think they're both important and good takeaways from the book. This is also a book that's very much about empathy. As you mentioned, we're all going through this, which means it's not just a matter of focusing on your own life transitions, but being aware that people around you are at some phase of multiple transitions as well, and being supportive to them. And we're all in multiple situations right now, collective, voluntary, in the case of national protest movements, which we are choosing to participate in or not, depending on what people are deciding, and multiple collective involuntary, or the pandemic, things that are part of our lives, whether we choose to accept that or not. Acceptance is not necessary. It's happening regardless. And it's happening to all of us. So what a wonderful time to be reminded of the importance of empathy. The other thing I want to jump in on too is this notion of classical stories that relate to this too. You mentioned many from scripture and several from classic stories as well. Is this, sort of a model of Joseph Campbell and the hero with 1,000 faces, where that's the
those are fighting
inciting
words,
incident, right? The transformation, the return home, which is a circle, always a circle, but perhaps a bit more complicated than that.
Yeah, those are fighting
your
words.
lens, rather than
those are fighting words. Okay, so let me work my way toward Campbell. And I want to pick up on two things.
Yep.
So in my book, I had all these life quakes, and it was clear that they were different. And so I divided them up, I mentioned earlier in our conversation, on two axes, voluntary and involuntary, right? So 53% were voluntary, involuntary 47% were voluntary. But I also did personal and collective. And most of them are personal. The smallest category was collective involuntary. And lo and behold, we are in this pandemic, which is the first collective involuntary life quake that the entire planet has gone through in a century. But one of the things that happened that I just heard so profoundly in these conversations day after day, which I just want to say flatly, in my experience, and I'm not in my office, I'm sort of upstairs in my family room here in Brooklyn, but I have shelves of social science, as you might imagine, and I have never seen this written about that these life quakes tend to clump. Okay, and I call this, as you know, the pileup, right? Just when you lose your job, you wreck your car, right? Just when you're going to move, your mother-in-law has cataract surgery, and your child is found to have an anxiety disorder. Like I call it pileup because it was like the old cars in the black and white movie, like one and then boom, 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 they hit. 2-car pileups, 3-car pileups. Some of this is coincidence and some of this is timing, but really I came to believe that what happens is that our sort of immune system is weakened by a life quake, so along comes something else. I think the best example, you alluded to it, and I want to kind of shine a light on it and say, here we are in the pandemic in 2020, and it's a collective involuntary life quake. And then along comes, certainly in Georgia, Ahmaud Arbery, in Louisville, Breonna Taylor, and then the George Floyd. Well, there have been dozens and dozens and dozens of these incidents. Why is it that the George Floyd incident, murder, whatever you want to call it, triggered this outpouring? I think you cannot separate it from the collective involuntary life quake. Suddenly this was a collective voluntary life quake, that we wanted to do something. And I think it's because our immune system was weakened. We all were home. We'd been cooped up for months. Right, we knew that the pandemic was disproportionately affecting minorities, and out came this reaction. And I don't think you can separate. And I think now that we're months in and we're turning now to each of our own lives, it's the same thing. We're weakened by this. So the idea that we should move or change jobs or leave a relationship or get sober or whatever it might be, become more religious, become less religious. These are related. And so I want to acknowledge that. Now, you brought up Joseph Campbell, and I want to say that sort of the Joseph Campbell, when he wrote Hero with 1,000 Faces, was it 1947 or something like that? When he did the interviews, the original interviews with Bill Moyers, it was the late 70s or early 80s, around the time that Passages came out. Around the time that the Bill Bridges book on transitions came out. We were full in the linear life now. And so while I believe, I want to just say that it's too linear from my point of view. I'll just be blunt about it. I think it's too linear that they must unfold in that order. And one example of that is the most salient attack on Hero with 1,000 Faces and the Hero's Journey already was from women, saying that it didn't reflect women's traditional rites of passage because of the biological clock and having children. And the best example of this I can say is that the person who invented the phrase midlife crisis, Elliot Jacques, the anthropologist, when he didn't interview anybody, he read 300 biographies of famous men, and he said in the original 50s speech, 57, 59, whenever it was, and then the 1963 article, he said in print that he didn't he didn't include women because menopause throws the whole thing off. What? I mean, if it's not applying to women because menopause, an activity that all women go through of a certain age, then that's telling you something that it's wrong, and if it only applies to men. And that was already a salient critique of the hero's journey. And so I think that the hero's journey, I don't necessarily mind the idea that there are these parts of the process, but they don't need to happen in order. In fact, they usually don't happen in order. And I think, like the 5 stages of grief, which has also been discredited, if you believe you have to first have denial and then have acceptance, and if you believe that and you do them out of order, which most people do, it can actually do harm. And so I want to say that life is nonlinear, the transitions themselves are nonlinear, and don't put that pressure on you to feel like, oh my God, I skipped stage 3 and therefore this is not a truly transformative experience. Forget it. It doesn't apply. Go through the process, do the parts. And what I found, I have 7 tools, as you know, is that everybody does some of them. Nobody does all of them, and everybody's kind of interested in what everybody else does. It's kind of, I have this old kind of throwaway line I say, which is like, sex and the internet are the same thing. Everybody wants to know what everybody else is doing, but nobody wants to ask. And I feel like that's what's here. Like everybody felt like, ooh, what's everybody else doing? I think that's actually one of the appeals here is I'm not telling you what to do. I'm really not wagging my finger and say, you must do this. I'm saying, I interviewed 225 people out of 1,000 pages of interviews. You read these stories, you're going to find ideas that'll help you kind of wherever you are in the process.
I think that's the beauty of the toolkit, of the resources in the book, that they don't have to be used in a sequence. They don't have to be used at all, in fact.
Correct.
If they're not appropriate for your particular situation. And that's the beauty of it. There's one particular tool that I want to talk about just briefly here, and we'll see if we've got some questions out there after that. It's something you mentioned a couple of times. It's part of, I think, the long goodbye as well. And that's the idea of shedding it, of getting rid of something. Yeah. Because so much of the linear models of growth, of life, or of progress are about adding, right? They're about finding yourself as though yourself is something that exists that you can go and find and acquire. But shedding, getting rid of things, is a challenge for so many people. And I'd love for you to talk about that tool, that resource, and maybe some of the stories that you've heard that support it.
So let's just reset the stage here. You've got these transitions. You have the life quake, voluntary, involuntary. The transition must be voluntary. Once you get into the transition, there are 3 phases: the long goodbye, the messy middle, the new beginning. Don't have to do them in order. Repeating for the umpteenth time just to reassure people. I then identified 7 tools that people do, and most of them are kind of broadly associated with one of the 3 phases. So the first phase is accept it, accept that this is an emotional experience and it's going to be difficult. Try to identify which emotion that you're dealing with. The second, that long goodbye, is sort of is actually using rituals. People jump out of airplanes, they get mementos, they build altars, I could talk to a guy who was in a loveless marriage in Kentucky for 30 years, got out, came out as gay, went to a sweat lodge to kind of sweat out that old persona. I talked to a woman in California, had an awful year. She went through, she was a bone marrow donor to her brother. She had a falling out with her mother. She went on 52 first dates. She actually made a spreadsheet of what she wore on every date because she only went on 7 second dates and she didn't want to wear the same thing on the second date that she wore on the first date. So she was like, this is not working. Like, my biggest fear is heights. So she jumped out of an airplane. A year later, she was married with a child. So that's the emotional part of it and using rituals. Then you get to the messy middle, and there's, broadly speaking, 2 parts of the messy middle. One is, as you say, shedding habits. Like you have, maybe you were, liked having money and kind of living a high life, and you've taken a job that maybe has less income because you want to or you were forced to, so you have to give up some dependence on money. Maybe you drank too much, right? Or maybe you had routines with an aging parent and that parent has now died or become demented in some way. So you have to shed. So people shed things that they like, but also interesting, they shed things that they don't like. Like, maybe they drank too much and they were bullying and they try to get sober and they're going to shed and confront that those bad habits. I talked to a woman who went through a tumultuous kind of later in life transition where she got self-diagnosed, had cancer, left her job. Her husband wasn't that good at taking care of her. She left the husband, and she said, I'm going to shed my habit of when I was unhappy. The first thing I did when I walked home every night was to open my fridge, then look around for something to eat. And so she finally gave up a lifetime of yo-yo dieting and lost 60 pounds. So people shed things that they liked about themselves, but also things that they didn't like about themselves. And the thing about that is when you're shedding something that you didn't like, it's giving you a sense of agency. Like in this time of tumult, you're getting control, right? You're off your heels, if you will, and you're back on your toes. And then what that does, just to do the flip side of shedding, is then, oh my God, I mean, just sitting where you're sitting, thinking of, this so applies to Pat Conroy, but people do astonishing acts of creativity. They sing, they dance. I talked to a woman who worked at Fox News, left, denounced her conservative views, went through depression. She taught herself ukulele because she said, even when I played poorly, it sounded really good. I talked to a guy, Zach Herrick, who was black, raised by white parents, adoptive white parents in Kansas, went through the military, got into Afghanistan, had his face shot off by the Taliban. 31 surgeries between the tip of his nose and the tip of his chin, including having his tongue sewn back on. Suicide ideation, at the verge of taking his own life multiple times. His mother moved nearby. You got to start cooking, Zach, because your palate has changed. He starts to cook, starts to write poetry, and then starts to splatter paint. He's like, that guy Jackson Pollock? Like him. Now he does art shows of these large-scale splatter paintings. He said, I used to splatter the enemy with bullets, and now I splatter the canvas with paint. And I think about Pat. Pat had a challenging upbringing, which he expressed so beautifully. And Pat reminds me of my friend and his contemporary Rosemary Danielle, just kind of the queen of Southern writers in Savannah. These are people who wrote themselves back to life. Rosemary had a very difficult, she's interviewed in my book, very difficult life, and it was like poetry that saved her in the middle of an early marriage, taking poetry classes from Dickey, and that's what Pat did. I mean, Pat writing, storytelling was how he made himself anew, and how he turned his pain into artistry. And that's what people do. They shed habits, and what the shedding does is create space in which you can begin to imagine. And I guess the thing I'll bring up at the end here is the pandemic. What happened when the first pandemic? It was the number one cliche of the pandemic, is that people started to bake. Like I think I'm the person in America who was least surprised by this. Like we sourdough'd our way through that early first quarantine. And what is that doing? It's sort of like getting dirty and getting messy. The act of imagining that you could make a piece of bread, a loaf of bread, or an apple turnover, or an apple pie, or a piece of pumpkin bread, whatever it might be. Just the act of imagining that allows you to imagine that you can make yourself anew. And that is what's so powerful about these transitions, is that people create themselves anew.
I think an act of creativity is always an act of self-creation too. And it's a lesson I've learned from a group of prisoners I get to work with as well in a journalism program. These are guys who are trying to rewrite the ends of their stories. And I've shared your book with them as well. It's completely relevant to their situation too. I think that's the big takeaway for them too. They're in this prison where people are painting and they are creating, and they're gardening and they're doing landscaping and they're learning all of these character restoration skills, as they're called, on the inside. And everything is about rewriting the end of your own story. It's about moving yourself towards some redemptive end. And that's the great hopeful moment of this book. I mean, even though we find ourselves in what often seems like a hopeless world, you've given us opportunity for hope. You've given us a toolkit. You've given ways to approach whatever the next phase of our life is. As my last question here before we run out of time, I'm really curious to know what responses you're getting in terms of people submitting life stories through your website now, having the context of the book, having it out there and circulating.
Well, since we are coming to an end, let me just again give a nod to my hero, Pat Conroy, and cheering you on and congratulating you. And certainly if there's anything that I or the whole community of Southern writers and readers to support, carrying this message path that these stories can come from anywhere and can come from anyone. I think we're all happy to help. I'll echo again what I said at the outset of thanking the Tennessee Humanities Council and the idea that stories from the South, which is of course the oldest coin of the realm of being a Southerner, still matter wherever those stories come from. So I will end by answering your question and saying that the people, from the minute this happened, from the minute this landed out in the world, people kind of raised their hand and said, "You're telling my story, and I'm working on my story. Thank you for validating that life is nonlinear and that these stories that seem non-traditional have a place." And yes, people are writing me. In fact, anybody who listening to us wants, if you go to brucefeiler.com, there's a way to share your story, and we have a tool, a kind of electronic tool where we can let you compare your story to the other stories and how you're similar and how you make meaning and the high points and low points. If you want to do with a loved one, the kind of storytelling project I did with my dad. I also, if you go to brucefeiler.com and click on the center of that tic-tac-toe board in the middle, I have a way that we will email you a question every Monday morning, a loved one, and gather stories. So I'm giving people that tool, which people are embracing way more than I expected. And you can also reach out through any, whatever, LinkedIn, social, Instagram, Facebook, you can Twitter, you can find me all over the place. And if you want to share your story, I just agree with my publisher to go out and gather more stories and continue asking a slightly different set of questions next time. But what I want to say about stories at the end, Jonathan, and I know you think about them so passionately, is that and this is speaking to your 16-year-old intern, we want to have the fairy tale. We want to be the hero who has the happy ending. That's what we want. But what we forget about fairy tales is that it's not the hero that makes it a fairy tale, and it's not the ending that makes it a fairy tale. It's the woods that makes it a fairy tale, and it's the wolf that makes it a fairy tale. That sooner or later, a wolf is going to pass up. And that wolf may be a wolf, or an ogre, or a dragon, or a troll, or a downsizing, or a diagnosis, or a tornado, or yes, a pandemic. But the essence of the story is that what the wolf is a breach in the normal. It is the aberration that pops up in our heroic journey. And the purpose of the story is to resolve the breach. It's to get through the woods. It's to get through, around, or over, or under the wolf. We want to banish the wolf, but we can't. And that's okay. Because if you banish the wolf, you banish the hero. And as I said earlier, the one thing that I've learned is that we have to be the hero of our own story. So what I want to say to everybody out there is whatever you're struggling with, whatever kept you awake last night, or whatever you sat with a cup of coffee and stared out, God willing, it was the marshes of the low country of Georgia and South Carolina, or maybe the mountains of Tennessee, of eastern Tennessee, or the rivers of central or western Tennessee, or wherever you are listening to this, and you're struggling with a wolf. I want to say that I was where you are. And I went out and I met hundreds of people who were where we were, and frankly, a lot worse. One thing about these stories is to make you happy for all the miseries you haven't faced. And they gave me more than hope. They gave me something that I felt I could do tonight, tomorrow, next week, next month, 6 months from now. So if you come on this journey with me, I think you're going to be inspired, but I think also you're going to want to take action and feel like there are more tools to get around that wolf. So that whatever you're dealing with, we're going to make it go a little bit easier and a lot more effectively. There is knowledge out there. We can get past these wolves together.
I don't think we're going to end our conversation on a better note than that, Bruce. So thank you so much. Thank you to everybody out there in Southern Festival of Books land for joining us this afternoon. So we've been talking with Bruce Feiler, author of Life is in the Transitions, available through Parnassus Books and lots of other fine independent booksellers as well. Thank you so much, Bruce, for your time, and congratulations on the great success of the book.
Thank you for your support, Jonathan. We'll get through this together, everybody.